Taiwan is an interesting case when it comes to geopolitics. For starters, it has one of the largest economies in the world today by GDP, a thriving democracy, and a semiconductor industry which, if stopped running, would effectively destroy the entire world economy. Taiwan has thus become what is arguably the single most important country of all 195 that exist today. Having said all that, it's the only one of its kind that's largely gone unrecognised by most of the world. As of 2024, only 13 countries maintain diplomatic relations with Taiwan, the largest being Guatemala, Haiti, and Paraguay. And since just 2019, China has managed to successfully convince the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Nicaragua, and most recently Honduras to abandon their diplomatic ties with Taiwan, in favour of China. The reason why most of the world has cut Taiwan off is because of the One China policy, which can be traced back to the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. But before we go into details, we'll make a few things clear first, otherwise the rest of the video will start to get pretty confusing. You see, it's much easier to understand the situation if we consider China as the Communist People's Republic of China, or PRC, and Taiwan as the remnants of the old Nationalist Government of China, officially the Republic of China, or ROC. Both sides fought a long and bloody civil war with each other for the control of all of China back in the early 20th century, which concluded with the eventual victory for the Communists who took over the mainland along with the subsequent retreat of the original government to the island of Taiwan, a relatively large island conquered and annexed by the centuries-old Qing dynasty in 1683, then annexed once again by Japan in 1895 and handed back to the ROC in 1945 following the empire's defeat in World War II. Now, although the violence came to an end in 1949, there's never actually been a formal peace agreement or treaty between the two sides ending the war between them, meaning that the Chinese Civil War never officially ended, but rather just remained frozen for the 75 years of history that followed ever since. And the PRC has repeatedly asserted over all this time that it is the sole government of all of China, including crucially Taiwan, which to use their words constitutes an inalienable part of that China. This in essence is Beijing's One China policy, and it's the reason that the PRC has never and will never recognise Taiwan as an independent country, but rather a renegade province led by what it sees as an illegitimate government who ought to return it to the motherland. It's the reason that Beijing refuses to have diplomatic ties to any country that recognises the ROC and not the PRC as the rightful government of all of China. It's because of this that most countries have therefore long abandoned any kind of formal relations with the ROC, in favour of the PRC, given there's a lot more people on the mainland and the manufacturing and economic base that China provides is a lot better for trade. The PRC also has a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, alongside only Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. If the PRC makes it a condition that a country must sever its diplomatic relations with Taiwan before it can establish any with China, it's not hard to see why hardly any country would be willing to go against it. The US and Taiwan have, however, agreed on a pact that allows the US to arm Taiwan, just in case the PRC does attempt any kind of aggression towards the island. The ROC, on the other hand, have always historically followed the One China policy as well. The ROC recognises that Taiwan is too an inalienable part of China in addition to the mainland. They just insist that they, instead, are the sole government of all of China, and not the PRC. This is Taiwan's version of the One China policy, and it effectively means that the ROC views all of mainland China as a large collection of rebellious provinces led by what they see as the illegitimate government of the PRC. And as ridiculous as it may sound, the ROC has to keep asserting that it is the sole and legitimate government of all of China, because if it didn't and instead claimed to be the government of only Taiwan, it could be seen in Beijing as the ROC's abandonment of the One China policy and its pursuit of formal independence. They'd effectively be opening a can of worms that would almost certainly elicit a military response from the PRC, in order to preserve the island's integrity as a core and inalienable part of China. Taiwan's recognition of the One China policy and its claim over all of mainland China effectively gives Beijing the legitimacy to assert that Taiwan is still indeed a part of China, that is only temporarily under the control of a rebellious government. Beijing knows that as long as the ROC continues to play along with this, there's still a slim chance that the island of Taiwan can be brought under Beijing's rule peacefully. But over the years, the chance of peaceful reunification between the two sides has been growing increasingly slim. Following Taiwan's transition to a democratic governance back in 1992, a poll from the National Cheng-Te University found that just 17.6% of the island's population identified as solely Taiwanese, followed by 25.5% who identified as solely Chinese, and a further 46.4% who identified as both. 3 decades later, in 2022, the same study found that the share of respondents who identified as solely Taiwanese had risen to a massive 63.3%, followed by a relatively insignificant 2.4% identifying as solely Chinese, and 30.6% identifying as both. What all of this essentially means is that the younger generations of Taiwan associate more with their Taiwanese identity, whilst the older generations prefer to associate with their Chinese identity. The way people identify, of course, plays a large part in the politics of Taiwan, which we'll see shortly. The two main political parties thus consist of the old Kuomintang party, who still uphold the status quo of Chinese nationalism, and the eventual peaceful reunification with the mainland, and the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, who've made it abundantly clear that it favours Taiwanese nationalism over Chinese nationalism. And whilst the DPP still support the status quo, they're much more fond of the idea of Taiwanese sovereignty, and eventual independence as opposed to reunification. Beijing, as you can probably imagine, would prefer to have the KMT in power, because they're at least to some degree willing to negotiate on some kind of reunification agreement with the PRC. Conversely, the DPP's position on Taiwanese sovereignty and eventual independence puts Beijing in a much more difficult position, which is why Beijing's been very vocal in its opposition to the DPP, and even cut off all communication with Taipei after the DPP rose to power in 2016. Now, in Taiwan's elections this year, the DPP managed to secure an unprecedented and historic third term in office, under President-elect Lai Ching-Te, a former doctor and vice president of Taiwan who's set to be inaugurated this Monday, shortly after the release of this video. Lai is not liked in Beijing. For starters, he openly vows to stand up to the PRC, and he was even once a vocal supporter of the independence movement. And although his views have tended more towards the status quo in recent years, it seems Beijing still haven't forgotten him for his past comments. On the eve of the polls, Beijing repeatedly called the vote a choice between peace and war, and labelling Lai as a, quote, dangerous separatist and war maker. The DPP are a minority government, however, considering they won only 40% of the public vote due to a breakthrough from the newly formed Taiwan People's Party, which promises more cooperation with Beijing, and which mopped up around 27% of the votes. It's because of this that Beijing has since rejected any offers to talk with the DPP, and Taiwan's defense ministry just reported that earlier this week, a total of 15 Chinese aircraft and warships were spotted carrying out even more combat exercises within Taiwan's maritime borders, which has become somewhat commonplace over the last 4 years since the DPP retook office. But the strange thing about this case in particular is that it's the third time in just a month that Chinese combat exercises have been reported within Taiwanese territory. Could China be bluffing? Probably, but now more than ever is not the time to underestimate China, who've openly declared that they have absolutely no intention to let Taiwan get away with anything that it sees as a move towards eventual independence. With Lai Ching-Te now in office, the possibility of Chinese interference and outright attacks cannot be ruled out. The new president, Lai Ching-Te, is set to take office this Monday, and depending on when exactly you're watching this video, it's most likely already happened. And as a result, the cross-strait relations between Beijing and Taipei may or may have not changed at all. But nevertheless, what President-elect Lai decides to say during his inauguration speech will likely set the tone for what's to come. It's very unlikely that Lai will openly pursue anything related to independence. It's not supported by the US nor the rest of the world, and would only jeopardize an already tense relationship between the ROC and the mainland, which really wouldn't work out in anyone's favour. Nevertheless, Lai has used ambiguous language in the past, and Beijing have always responded. Now that he's president, the pressure to get things right with China have never been more important. I hope you managed to learn a thing or two from this video. A lot of effort goes into making them, and if you haven't yet subscribed, now would be a good time to do so. Don't forget to also hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.